Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I'm Andrea Mathern.
We are two friends, a therapist and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief. Today, we're going to do an episode of Grief on the Screen where we're going to take different television series and movies, and these will be a sequence of a theme that we'll put out regularly, but we'll focus on one specific show or movie that we think that dealt with grief, and then we'll have opinions about how they're managing grief. But before we get started today, I thought I would check in with your heart. How was your heart this morning, Andrea?
This morning, it feels pretty full. Yesterday was my dad's birthday, and I find his birthday much more of a tender day than the day he died for me, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think on his birthday, I really feel that absence of another year past, that he missed a whole year of things. And so it was a really busy day. We always cook a special dinner of some of his favorite foods. And so it was running around and getting all the food and doing all that. And then before I started cooking, I sat down and went through pictures of him and just by myself and lit some candles and just bawled my eyes out. And yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, his birthday is very, very hard for me, much harder than his death day. But it was beautiful. We had a really impressive, I'm very impressed with myself, a very impressive feast. And my mom was with us, and then all the siblings and my nephew all hopped on a call together, and we just shared memories of my dad and funny stories, and it was really beautiful.
That's really sweet. That also makes a lot of sense to me because I don't actually remember the date of my dad's death, and I don't make a strong effort to. I have had so many opportunities to go ahead and memorize it, and I just don't.
That's so funny. I don't either.
Yeah.
I know ish when it is, but I could not tell you the date.
Yeah, it was after Thanksgiving. It was before December started, and Thanksgiving changes every year. So it's just this sort of somewhere in the 20-somethings of November, and I don't care. Yeah. I mean, I'll always remember his birthday and think of him as that day comes and goes. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense that that would be more of a day of remembrance. My heart this week is good. I feel sort of two things in my heart this morning. I've been busy in a way that I can feel the overwhelm in my heart, that there's this sense of longing for life to not have to be this busy. And I can feel that bubbling up. And then I am leaving in a few hours to go on a mini retreat with your husband and other humans from my graduate school cohort. And so I feel like excitement. Yeah, I love the land that we're going to. It has a lot of memories of stillness and getting to be unplugged from the world. Yeah. And so I'm just excited to unplug in a way that the overwhelm doesn't get to follow me. There's literally nothing I can do. I have agreed to unplug for 24 hours, and I'm going to do that. And so that feels really sweet.
Oh, that's so great.
So that's where I am this morning.
Oh, good. Yes, I'm excited for you all. I know you're kind of in two places at once because you have other exciting obligations at home, but I'm glad you'll get a little time with everyone. I know my husband's looking forward to it as well. Yeah. But I am excited about this new subset miniseries that we're going to do.
Yeah.
I think you and I texted about this show that we're going to talk about today, which is Shrinking, which is on Apple TV. And I started to watch it. I do think Jason Segel is pretty funny. And I was just like, Harrison Ford is going to be on Apple TV. That's exciting. And I started to watch it and like immediately stopped because it's about therapists. So I was like, my husband has to watch this with me. And I was curious. I found it really funny and like behind the curtains of how therapists can kind of feel sometimes working with clients. But I am curious, I was nervous to show it to my husband because I thought, well, what if he doesn't think this is funny? And it's like, you can't make light of being a therapist. He didn't. He found it very, very funny, and we had a great time watching it. But I am curious, sort of your initial reaction when you
Yeah.
found it and started watching.
Well, I always hate the portrayal of therapists in movies and on television because
Mm,
mostly, I mean, I feel like there's some that are done well and
sure.
but a lot of times it's about the client falling in love and then somehow it's okay that they date and it just like that
Mm.
if that happens to you, please report this therapist because it is such a boundary violation and ethics violation. And that said, in shrinking, there are all of these boundary violations and ethics violations, but they happen in a context, and the other therapists are saying, you're doing it wrong and you shouldn't be doing that. And this is dangerous territory. So it's like acknowledging that these things aren't okay versus the way it's usually treated, where it's just like, oh, isn't this so sweet? They got vulnerable with each other and now they're in love. And it's like, no, that's not
Right.
sweet. That's an abuse of client and therapist relationship. So yeah, I have really enjoyed this show. I'm learning some therapists have critiques, but I think that I enjoy a little bit of that pulling the curtain back and not having the therapist be this infallible creature who can manage everything and is
Right.
unfazed by life events and has all the wisdom and even just the I think a little bit of that there are times where I would say every therapist I know and I happen to know a lot of therapists so I feel like it's a pretty good sampling of humans that there's always that therapist fantasy to say stop doing the thing you're doing just do this or just listen to me and let me be advicey and if you're trained well you don't want to be advicey and you want people to find
Right.
their own wisdom and there's all of these sort of beautiful ways that you're helping them learn to be their own rock and their own guide and you're just providing that space but it is fun to just watch him sort of as he's devolving be like I'm just going to tell you what to do
Totally.
in this really aggressive way and yeah and so I do want to just as because we haven't said much yet but if you
Right.
haven't watched it and you don't want spoilers probably not the episode for you
Totally.
we're gonna say spoilers but if you've watched it and you just kind of want to hear some banter about the themes of grief in it this might be the episode for you.
Yes. So we'll dive in. So for those who either are open to having spoilers or have seen it, the founding grief, the sort of foundational grief, or the main crux of the story is Jimmy, who is the main character, played by Jason Segel, but we'll just call him Jimmy. We sort of are introduced to him in this super chaotic, super irresponsible life that he's having. Drugs, drinking, likely some sex workers, companions. So just this flurry.
Well, he has a teen daughter who's in high school and living at home and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like not just an adult making these choices as an adult, but a parent parenting a teen daughter making these choices in his own home where she lives. So it's just this sort of, and we realize it's because his wife has passed, but we don't know why. You don't know why. Or do we even know? Yeah, we know she's passed.
Pretty quickly and they reveal that. Yeah, in the first episode.
Yeah, but I think it's a little while later how we find out how she died. So this is sort of the overarching theme of grief. And what caught me was that it was so messy.
Mm-hmm.
There were these moments of tenderness, like that tender, heartbroken grief, where they would even change the camera, they would change the lighting, and he would sort of recall these memories of his wife, he and his wife. But most of it was him making choices that were really sort of self-medicating avoidance choices. And it was such a messy way to grieve. And I thought all of us have probably done some type of, maybe not all of these at once, like Jimmy does, but some type of grief avoidance behavior. And so that was like the first thing that I noticed was just how messily they portrayed his grieving process or his purposeful avoidance of grieving.
Right. It feels like they led with this is the cost of not grieving, like that he really didn't want to feel the grief. He didn't want to feel the pain. And pretty early on, I want to say also in that first episode, you become aware that the daughter did go through grief and
Yeah.
did feel what she felt. You see that this teenager who's faced losing her mom and kind of had to do it alone because her dad wasn't present or whatever, she's
Mm-hmm.
further along in her process of grief than he is because he's avoiding it. But like we've said on previous episodes, it doesn't, you don't get to do that. You don't get to be like, and now I'll check back in a year plus later and it'll have gone away and
Right.
now I don't have to feel it. It's like it's right there, like it just happened. And I feel like they touched on that in a way that does make me curious about the creators of the show and their relationship with grief, because it felt like that's a pretty decent portrayal of the ways we want to avoid and what it takes to avoid, and that it's right there when you're back in it. And then they really, there's the surface level of, okay, this is a show about a therapist who has grief that he doesn't want to deal with, which is so interesting because as therapists, you
Right.
would probably assume that we would all be like, feel your feelings, but it's hard to ask someone to feel grief, and especially life cut short abruptly. And we learn more and more about their relationship and what was making that even harder for him. And then we learn that there are all these other griefs that are kind of coming up throughout the show. And as we were unpacking that, like, oh yeah, and there's also this grief. And then there's also this grief. We were realizing, I think every character
Yeah.
is managing some level of grief. And it's just another layer of depth that really makes me appreciate the show. It's a funny show. It's probably predominantly meant to be
Mm-hmm.
humorous, but I think really touches into tenderness in a smart way. So,
Absolutely. And I love what you said at the beginning, and we'll sort of dive into all the different streams of grief and the different characters. But I love what you said at the beginning about how, while Jimmy is making these very radical choices as a therapist, his colleagues, so Gabby and Paul, are calling him out, are saying, like, this is a terrible idea. You need to stop this. So just like how they're calling him out and sort of calling attention to the boundary pushing choices or totally crossing choices that he's making as a therapist, Paul, who serves, it's Harrison Ford as the actor, and he serves as Jimmy's mentor, really tells him throughout the show, you are not feeling your feelings, like you are avoiding grief.
mhm.
And I remember there's like a scene, and I think Sean is in there, who's a client of Jimmy's that he does this crazy experimental therapy with. And Harrison's talking about sort of like not dealing with things and how it comes back and kind of like bites you in the ass. And you see Jimmy kind of have this, I know you're talking about me, but it's not going to happen to me, because I think he believes in this way that he's kind of retaking control of his life. Like, I'm going to be this kind of therapist. I'm going to be the kind of therapist that just tells people how it is. He's really trying to reintegrate as a dad with his young daughter, being more sometimes meanly honest with his highly involved neighbor. I think he feels this empowerment where he's like, well, see, I can deal with anything. I've become this better person, so I don't have to worry about grief. And obviously, it is coming for him no matter what.
Mhm. Yeah. And before we start to talk about more, I do have this curiosity. When you look back at your relationship with grief over your lifespan, were there ways that you avoided or you can relate to avoiding grief and then finding that there just wasn't a way?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, the one that I remember was I was working at like a youth development center, and one of my colleagues was murdered.
Mm.
And I remember walking to work and getting the phone call. And I remember like the world almost in slow motion. Like, one step ago, everything was normal, and two steps
Mhm.
further, everything is totally different. And I didn't have very much longer until I got to the office. And I remember thinking, I have to figure out a way to compartmentalize this, because I'm about to walk in with a lot of young people for who, like, we have to deliver this message, hold space for these young people. And I remember tucking it up,
Mhm.
just tucking it up and packaging it up and being like, you just don't get to do this. Like,
Mhm.
you don't get to be really sad about this, because you have to be there for these young people, some of whom probably don't have people to talk about this with. And so it was days, it was like delivering the message and then really being there for all these young people and then getting to the funeral, getting through the funeral, watching just these young people break down. It was just so devastating. And I really thought I've done well. Like I've held my shit together. I've done well. And then I walked into work and my other colleague had packed up Juan's office, taken everything off the walls. And I literally, when I say I lost my shit, I lost my shit.
Yeah.
I think back to that moment and I'm like, how did I not get fired? I mean, I didn't hit anybody or anything. I
Yeah.
didn't lose my shit like that. But I mean, I yelled and was
Mm-hmm.
just like, what the fuck is wrong with you? And kind of that frantic,
Yeah.
like pulling things out of his hand, like, give me that stuff back. You can't touch it. I had to leave. I was just so overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I had to leave. And this poor guy, my poor colleague, was just staring at me. And I remember him saying, like, Andrea, we have to do it sometime. And to me, it was just, but right now isn't the moment.
Yeah.
And why did you get to decide what the moment was? And I just totally lost it. And I remember thinking, well, I guess it did have to come out. And unfortunately, it came out really screaming and yelling
Yeah.
very dramatically. But that's one I can really think of. Luckily, the sort of consequence of holding it in came out pretty quickly. That probably all spanned 3 weeks
Yeah.
from the moment we found out to him taking down everything in the office. But yeah, that was one. Do you have one?
Yeah. Well, I just to reflect on that story too. I hear you saying, unfortunately, it came out
Oh, yeah.
bigly. And I think only unfortunate because everyone's so uncomfortable with grief and in the workplace and all the things we discussed.
Yeah.
But it's like, gosh, I mean, of course. And I'm sad that people weren't melting down with you. I
Right.
feel like that seems like a completely appropriate response.
Or like looking, I appreciate that. Sorry to interrupt, but I think looking back at it and sort of hearing your response, and I think at some point we'll kind of talk about grief in the workplace. I think something that could have been really beneficial because there were a staff of adults and then there were a staff of young people who had come through the program, but were now sort of young adults, 18, 19, 20, working there. And then there were like staff who were in the youth development program. And I feel like we all knew we were going to need to hold space for our youngest staff members. And so creating something for the adults to
Mm-hmm.
have space to grieve and
Mm-hmm.
process probably would have been insightful.
Totally. And it's interesting because when I think about, I mean, the major griefs that I experienced that kind of came back to back, I was in a place in my life where I really was okay with letting myself feel whatever I was feeling. And I
Mm,
had sort of had that practice. So it wasn't, there was no part of me that wanted to like button it up or be done with it. It wasn't comfortable. I won't say that preparing in that way makes grief easier. It just made me understand the necessity of feeling the pain and that it wouldn't go away. So I kind of knew that when the major griefs happened, but I do remember when I was going through my divorce, a lot of people
mm,
were wanting to take me out drinking or some
yeah.
version of just like, oh, let's go have fun and distract. And I refused. And I was like, I'm not going to try to get out of my feelings because I, at this point, know they're going to be hanging out waiting for me. So
Mm,
I spent that time sober and in a lot of pain, but I'm glad I did. I think it was really beneficial to just stay with it. And yeah, and that I watched my ex-husband, who was sort of, even though it was his choice, he was self-destructing and he really wasn't looking at anything that was painful. So then when it finally hit him what was happening
mm.
and he started to feel the pain, I mean, I almost relate more to the daughter kind of being like, yeah, it sucked for the last 6 months, but I'm actually doing okay now.
Right.
So I don't know how to be here for that you have all this regret and sadness and like, good luck with that because
Right.
you were on a drinking and drug bender to like avoid feeling any of this and imagining your life being so fun. And this is the reality. We had a lot of years and it's a lot to dismantle a relationship. And so
Oh, yeah, that makes so much sense that you would really resonate with the daughter who's like, okay, well, I dealt with it while you were
I'm
drowning it.
I'm as good can be in this horrible fucking
Right.
situation. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
now you're back, and I don't really have the patience, nor should you necessarily have to, as the other grieving party
Right.
for that. And so,
Right.
leaping off that, another theme of shrinking is I mean, I think there's like a meta theme of relationship grief.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those, which shows up in a couple different ways, is father-daughter relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
so the one that we've kind of been touching on is the relationship between Jimmy and his daughter Alice, which becomes incredibly fractured. You kind of sense in her a loss of respect for her dad
Mm-hmm.
in the way that he's chosen to deal with grief. I mean, I think in one scene, she even says, I wiped your cocaine off the mirror last night or something.
Yeah.
She's like, I am taking care of you as you are totally devolving into just a human that I think she was not used to seeing. Like, this was
Mm-hmm.
not her father. And his awakening and desire to come back into her life, you know, he has so much road to make up because he really spent the year avoiding her. And there was this touching moment. They kind of open and close the series with this, where she's kind of like confronting him a little bit of, what's been your fucking problem? I've been grieving all by myself. Like, I lost my mom.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just you. And he looks at her and he's got like tears in his eyes and he's like, you just look so much like her.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see that he's just that his own daughter reminded him so much of his wife, he couldn't even bear it. And then at the very end of the season, they're like at this wedding and they're dancing and he's dancing with her and having so much fun. And he's got a smile on his face and he says, you look so much like your mom. But it's in this complimentary way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, their journey together as a father-daughter is certainly central to it.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that element of her maturity, and also letting him back in is really slow for her, and I think
Mhm.
with good reason.
Absolutely.
Can I trust that you can hold me because you dropped me hard? And you think about, she not only lost her mom, she lost her dad. They talk about it through the lens of anger, but that there's a certain grief. I mean, her life fell apart and the person who should be holding her wasn't holding her because he was falling apart. And I think that that's really common.
Yeah.
I think it's hard. And I have compassion as a parent that there are moments that are really hard, like when my daughter's dad and I split up and I was in my grief about that. And, you know, it's like, oh, and I have to show up for this 2-year-old who has all these needs. And there's this
Right.
way that I have to compartmentalize that for a moment and just know when she goes to his house, I can feel my grief again. But it's a hard thing to balance. And I think we could do better as a community supporting people and see the neighbor, Liz. So
Mhm.
Liz wanting to support, but there's a way that even her support gets kind of muddy and complicated, and she's getting needs fulfilled through being the caretaker, being the savior.
Well, before we go to Liz,
Uh-huh.
I was also thinking about what you were saying around she lost both parents. And something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of grief is that shift in family dynamics. And I think this is a really obviously dramatized portrayal of it, but that it does shift. You know, I think losing my dad shifted our entire family dynamic. It shifted our relationship with our mom. It shifted our relationships with each other. It shifted tremendously our relationship with my dad's family. You know, he was our
Yeah.
link to them. He was
Right.
the oldest of 8, and he would call all of his siblings every Sunday. He would just gotta go through and just say hi to them. And we would go to my parents' house on Sundays to eat dinner. That was just like the time we all came together. And so we would just by proxy be on the phone, like, hi, Auntie Sandra, hi, you know, Auntie Joanne, hi, whoever he was talking to. And I think in the pieces of kind of trying to pick up and reintegrate relationships after his passing, I think that's one that has kind of fallen to the wayside. And I think there's this other grief that happens where it's like, oh my gosh, not only did I lose this person, but I lost kind of like I imagine in a divorce, it's friendships that were tied to you as a couple. For me, it was like an entire side of my family that I lost, who I know if I show up are going to embrace me and love me and whatever. But my dad was really the key to that. I remember my mom saying she went to a family function. We happened to be out of town. And she was so overwhelmed. She had to leave because she was like, I feel so lonely without him here because he is the link and has been, even though she's been in their family for 40 years. He was really the link between her and them. And she's never wanted to go back because it just felt so overwhelmingly sad. So as you were talking, I was thinking about
Mm-hmm.
that, just about how part of grief are these kind of aftershocks of things you just don't expect, to
Mm-hmm.
see the cracks start to appear of, oh my goodness, this relationship is totally different. That relationship is gone.
Yeah. I think about that in just a sort of anticipatory potential grief kind of a way, but I do think about that for my daughter. I'm like, if anything happened to me,
Mm.
I mean, my partner and his daughter are her stepdad and
Yeah,
stepsister to her. And like, she doesn't just lose me, she loses them too. And will they make an active attempt to stay in her life? But it's just going to look really different. It's not going to look like a custody schedule, like the amount that she sees them now. And I feel sad
sure.
thinking those thoughts. But yeah, I think it's worth acknowledging that there are so many additional ways that things change and that change can bring other grief with
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so the daughter is kind of experiencing all of this, and I think coming to like know her dad and not sure if the version of her dad that was her dad is going to come back in this kind of rebuilding of trust, or if, this kind of like debaucherous dad is who she's stuck with.
Mhm.
And in that, the next door neighbor, Liz, steps in as this kind of surrogate parent. And, it's almost at times when you're watching, almost unnerving how much this woman is around, but she had to be because Jimmy just was completely unavailable. And then you kind of come to understand Liz's story a little bit, that she was this devoted mom who stayed home and raised her children, and her boys are all out of the house now. And so it's also this moment where she's probably filling a hole in her heart of being an empty nester from her boys,
Mhm.
and a need that's there. You have this young teenage girl who needs a parental figure and could use a loving female figure in the absence of her mom. So it's this beautiful unveiling, sometimes, yeah, like humorous, when Jimmy kind of confronts her about being overly involved, or Gabby, who was Tia, the wife's best friend, kind of confronting her about being over involved. But communally, everybody's settling in on maybe she was, and it was also totally necessary, I think, is kind of where it landed.
Yeah, I agree. It was necessary, 1,000%. It was necessary. And almost this, gosh, thank goodness someone showed up for this child. And when she's not needed anymore,
Mm,
she really, she's confronted with, I wasn't just helping to be helpful. This was filling something for me. And now I feel that grief, or I'm
mm,
starting to feel this loss. Yeah, just interesting, those ripple effects.
mhm.
Sometimes we don't recognize our motives until the being helpful isn't needed anymore. And then you're like, oh,
Yeah.
I needed it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's such a great reflection. There's also another one. So I mentioned this character earlier, and his name is Sean. And Sean is this young man who has returned from combat and has PTSD. And he ends up in Jimmy's office. And there's so much happening. It's this young man who's served his country. While I think Jimmy's wife was Asian and I think his daughter is biracial, Sean
Mm-hmm.
and Gabby are like the only Black folks on the show. So there's also this added element of, he's like this young Black man who's suffering from PTSD, and it's come out in these really violent episodes. So when they first meet, Jimmy is kind of an example of the worst therapist ever. He's a total shit show. He's hungover, he can't listen. It's just kind of this archetype of a nightmare therapist. But over the course of the show, they develop this friendship and this bond. And you see different ways that grief is entangled with the PTSD that Sean is feeling. And one that was really tender was just the person that he was before combat and the person that he is now. He'll never get to be that person again. The innocence of it, the innocence of
Yeah.
not having been in combat, he'll never get that back. And how he's hyper aware of it, but the world isn't. So his family isn't hyper aware of it and views him just as kind of in this heroic lens. But he's trying to deal with the horrors of what he saw in combat and how it
Mm-hmm.
has impacted who he is. So I just thought the way that they slowly showed you his grief and
Mm-hmm.
gave a different nuance to PTSD that tied grief with it was really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's some tragic element of what Jimmy decides to do is move him into his house, and there are reasons that we don't do this with clients. One of many ethics violations that Jimmy decides to do, but that there is something in the humanity of Jimmy recognizing grief and having a way of holding Sean that no one else around him is doing. His family's like, you're the hero, but then you're a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Society is treating him like he's a problem for his anger outburst, and that's the only lens they can see him through. And that Jimmy has this more compassionate and nuanced view of him and really believes in him, but then rescues in a way that ultimately is super problematic. Watch the show if you're hanging in here, letting us have all the spoilers to really understand why that therapist that you wish would be like, come move in with me, does not do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then there's more grief.
There's more grief.
So
There is more grief. We had talked about the father-daughter relationship between Jimmy and Alice, but then there's another father-daughter dynamic that sort of comes to the forefront. And you had talked about raising your daughter between two households. And what we see in this is Paul is pretty not estranged in that they don't talk at all, but has a very, very distant relationship from his daughter, who, after a divorce, his ex-wife moves across the country. And in his daughter's eyes, Paul just kind of like let work continue to take over his life and put her in the back seat, if she's even in the car, I think would be how she felt. Again, I think it's this behind the scenes of somebody who is this wonderful therapist. I think people are trying to get in. He ends up getting an award, but who totally, absolutely doesn't have his shit together. He doesn't even have an intimate relationship with his daughter. Like they're nearly strangers, you know, when she comes to visit the first time.
Yeah. And he doesn't want to deal with a lot of stuff in his life.
Yeah.
He is diagnosed with Parkinson's and isn't really wanting to talk about that or do anything towards it. And that what's so interesting to me is he's in the position of mentor. And so he's really holding this line with Jimmy. All of these things you're doing, you don't get to avoid this grief forever. You're not dealing with your life. And I think it's a good example of don't put people on a pedestal just because they're giving you really sound advice. Kind of recognize we're all in the human struggle, and sometimes it's just easier to see on someone else and offer the thing that's going to support. And then with ourselves, it's just harder, and we have our own really protective mechanisms that have helped us survive, and they're well-worn pathways, and we just keep following them. So I just thought it was an interesting, like a different angle of compassion again for, oh, there's this whole backstory of why this person is the way he is. And he's pretty hard to get to know even with the people around him. Like he's just a very private person.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing it reminded me of was you're looking at different people in different stages of their life. And it's like, whew, the work to be a more open, connected, loving human is never ending. You know, like we will constantly be faced with that shadow side or with that challenge that, you know, that will really ask us to lean in and think about what's hard for us. You know, I think with Paul, there's like this independence and he gets Parkinson's and you know where that's going. And he's, you know, on one hand, he's doing what he's supposed to, like he's going to the doctor regularly, he's doing these exercises. But on the other hand, there's this fierce identity that he doesn't want to give up of strength, of independence, his driving, his all these different things.
Not drinking enough water.
Not drinking enough water. Yeah, Gabby's mission in life, to hydrate people. Yeah, so I think that's another thing that came out of that.
Yeah, and I think you're looking at also different generations.
Yeah.
I've known people in his generation as therapists. It feels like a pretty good match, this sort of a stoic way of being the analyst and kind of like, yes, I can listen and I'm going to hold to these ethics and these things are really important to me. And you see like a loosening as you move into Gabby and Jimmy's generation of therapists, and that Jimmy like listening way too much and Gabby kind of being more like, I'm cool and there's things that I'm going to and I'm just going to be an open book with everybody and say what's up for me. And that's just a different paradigm than he's in. And so it just interesting to see their interactions. And he also does take a bit of a fatherly role for
Mm-hmm.
Alice, Jimmy's daughter, so he has his own struggle with his daughter, but then he has this relationship with Alice where they talk regularly. And it's sort of, you can feel the lines blurred of grandfatherly slash
Yeah.
therapist-y, that he's kind of shouldn't be her therapist ethically, but he's showing up for her in that way. And so you can see the way the community kind of shows up where there's a void that people are filling,
Yeah.
a mother and a father void for Alice. Yeah.
Absolutely. There are a couple other themes that I was thinking of in Jimmy's depths of despair, the fracturing of his friendships. So you kind of quickly learn that he had a best friend that he's shut out of his life so much that he wants to hide when he sees him at a gas station or something like kickboxing class.
Mm-hmm.
But he's like terrified of seeing him because he's really just shut this human out. You realize that Gabby was his wife's best friend, but he's not leaning on her as a friend of his and someone else who's probably experiencing this loss in some way that they can connect to each other. And you see him start to kind of come out of that and really lean into this little community that he has. And so it's just, I think it's like this beautiful thing where you see him not turning to his community and then slowly building it back in through these beautiful friendships.
Mm-hmm. And there's also this friend was not really great at showing up for him in his grief.
Right.
And you start to understand why he pushed him away. And that he says, what's the line? Oh, everything goes my way. He's like super positive, and that I can relate to having people in our lives who they just believe that life is good and all the things work out good. And here you are grieving this loss that shouldn't have happened, and it's horrible. And he's like, why would I want to hang out with someone who's constantly saying everything goes my way? Jimmy's like, why would I want to hang out with someone who says everything goes my way? My wife died. And he's like, oh, I didn't say everything goes your way. I say everything goes my way.
I did think that was funny.
It's a sweet moment. I mean, it's handled well and tenderly in that moment, but it's sort of another piece of the show that I just appreciate. It's like there's the gravity of what's happening and the intensity of how we feel as humans, and this way of how levity can still exist in that space. And I think that forgiveness kind of could happen in that moment where you can feel he knows he's been sort of an insufferable optimist, but he's making a little joke about it. But he really does care a lot for Jimmy and wants to be there for him, and can recognize that's where the rupture was in their friendship.
Yeah. And then later, in like yet another kind of way that grief masks itself, or that we mask our grief, you find out that this sort of everything goes my way optimism and confidence comes from Brian growing up, I think, like in the South, in a very conservative community and family, and comes out as gay, and sort of the pain of having to hide this person that he was, and just saying, like, if I just own that everything will go my way, I can't be hurt like that anymore. But in that, he also talks about it's created this inability for him to take chances, including being able to ask his longtime partner to marry him. And it resurfaces, it resurfaces when he asks his dad to be his best man. And his dad very clearly is super uncomfortable with the idea of, like, he'll be at his gay son's wedding, but he's super uncomfortable about the idea of standing up there. And you see the heartbreak of this guy, and that the cracks in that mask of optimism and everything goes my way. And you see why he wouldn't ask his dad for something like that. And here he kind of went out on this limb to ask, and that old wound is just ripped right back open. And I think, in the end, Jimmy's the one that kind of comes to the rescue and mends that. And I think I see it as just a way for him to also understand Brian has this very different but long-term grief, and Jimmy kind of, he fixes it up. He like builds that bridge through a very honest conversation with Brian's dad. And I thought that was beautiful too, because I think now, like, queer identities on the screen, they are multifaceted, whereas I think before they were like fabulous and they were like this one-dimensional thing. And here you have like a little bit of all of that, right? Brian is fabulous and has this saying, which I think is part of that gay caricature. But then you see this real moment of, and he's still scared of being accepted, even though he's successful and has found love and is going to be married. His dad still has the power to hurt him. And I just thought about my previous partner was a woman. And when I came out to my family, I remember something like they say in the queer community, it's like you never actually stop coming out. Every time you turn around, there are these assumptions of heterosexuality or these assumptions of how you should act as a queer person when you're in heteronormative spaces.
Yeah.
And if you don't and are kind of chastised for that, like, how dare you ask me to be your best man? It's really painful and just kind of brings up that reservoir of pain and rejection.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Do we want to touch on Gabby before we close?
Let's do, because she's just the best.
Yeah, I love Gabby, and she has grief too.
She does. She does. So she's getting a divorce, and I think there's multiple layers of her grief in that divorce. There's divorce, which is, even if it's the right choice, it doesn't come without pain and loss. And there was addiction and having tried her best and the grief of all the choices that she made throughout her career and her partnership with her ex-husband to put him and his health and safety first, and how she gave up what she wanted to do. So there's also like this grief of, I gave up so much of myself to help and save this person because she loved him, but it also was many, many sacrifices. So yeah, I love Gabby too.
Yeah, she's one of the stronger characters in the show, and just there's so much really refreshing about her straightforwardness and honesty that a lot of the characters are just struggling with. And so, I mean, except for the moment when she's sort of like, I'm dropping off a basketball. And it's like not what she's doing. That for the most part, she just is not gonna bullshit with people. And I think you're watching a lot of people who have so much carefulness with each other, and she's just like, yeah, no, fuck that, let's be real. And she's great.
She's wonderful, and she has so many one-liners.
And that's what I think, even though we've revealed a lot of the storyline, and if you just thought, oh, I'll just listen because maybe I won't watch it, and now you want to watch it, we didn't ruin it for you.
No.
The writing is really good. It's so entertaining. I feel sad that I'm still waiting for another season. I just really look forward to seeing more of the show.
Absolutely. The same. So yes, watch it, rewatch it, maybe with another lens.
I want to rewatch it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. And it's one that you can. So yeah, well, before we hop off, how are you connecting into your grief this week, Rebecca?
I've been reading this book. It was one that Sandra, who was a guest on our show, had talked about that she read. It's called The In-Between, and it's a woman who was a hospice worker, but she's with people a lot in their death. But really sweet and tender experiences with people, and the experience of people as they're dying. You know, I keep thinking of you being with your grandmother, and this thing that she talks about that really struck me was the way the room feels different. And before you might even know that the breath stopped or the heartbeat stopped, and before she's confirming that, you can feel that the person is gone, and everything shifts, the energy just shifts. But she talks a lot about as you're dying. She has such a heart-centered way of being with people. And she was a nurse. You know, I think there are different people that work in different positions in hospice, but she's trained as a nurse. And that a lot of people are like, hey, don't get attached. It's going to be hard. And she's like, oh, I'm getting attached. And so she experiences grief over and over again with each of these deaths. And her talking about her grief, I really am feeling connected to that this week. And what that must be for people who do work with people, end of life care, death doulas. Yeah. How about you? How are you touching into your grief?
Well, Anderson Cooper's podcast.
Yes.
You're so amazing, Anderson Cooper. Yeah. So this week he had President Biden on to talk about the series of grief experiences that he's had with loss of family members. So, you know, his wife and very young daughter killed in a car crash and then losing his son Beau. And mostly, I think what I felt even more than the president's story, because even though he was open and vulnerable, and I think that was a really human move for him to make, he was still a politician. Or like there would be these fucking soundbite phrases where I'm like, real people don't fucking talk like that. But what I hear is just this continued journey of Anderson Cooper's to like find a way to live with his grief. And it's so moving and tender. And I feel like he's a journalist. So I feel like there's this part of him that's like, if I talk to enough people, I'll be able to research my way through grief a little bit, where I'm like, oh, man, it's not going to happen. But he's doing it, which is really amazing. But there was this phrase, and I think when we opened, you said something that reminded me of it. So the week before, Francis Weller, who wrote The Wild Edge of Sorrow, was on, and that was an incredible episode. He said to Anderson something about we need to welcome our grief, and only through that sort of welcoming can we be fully alive. And I think Anderson was like, I hear the words that you're saying, and I can't even fathom what that means. And he said it to President Biden, and the president was like, oh, I don't think you welcome it. No one would welcome grief, but I think you kind of integrate it, was kind of what he was saying. But when you were talking at the opening, I was thinking about the welcoming doesn't necessarily need to be like a celebratory, yay, I'm so glad grief is here, but that it's an owning of it, that it's like, I still stick with this idea of integration, that it's like, this is what it is in all of its fullness, and the parts of me that want to turn away, and the parts of me that want to break down crying, and the parts of me that want to scream at someone, in all of those parts, and welcoming all those pieces of yourself as important parts of yourself. You know, I think you and I have talked about just being highly sensitive and how long it took me to be proud of that. If I didn't cry at anything, literally I cry over everything. Like if I didn't cry over everything, I also probably wouldn't be 43 and stop in the street because the sky is so blue. I'm like so ecstatically overwhelmed by it. And so I think grief is the same. In the depths of my loss, I also am able to really own the depths of my love. And it's terrifying, right? Because it's like, oh my gosh, I love my husband so much. Oh my gosh, I love these little boys so much. And there is a possibility of losing them, like whether I lose them tragically or I go first, like I'm losing that. But I would never want to live without the bright sides. And so sort of those dark moments have to come into it. So I've just been sitting a lot with that idea of welcoming grief, and it can be a begrudgingly welcome, but that I do embrace it all.
Well, the word that I love for it is allowing. And so I think welcoming might be a great word for Francis Weller, and that might really resonate with him. And I think language is a symbol. Language is a way that we're trying to represent something. So I think finding the word for yourself feels really important. But I know for me, allowing, it's sort of what you were saying before. I mean, this is what's here. This is what's happening. And I think fighting against it doesn't work. It really doesn't. It's not going away. And it's sort of like you're saying, I mean, I think there's a simultaneous thing happening with Anderson Cooper where he's working to be in the grief and to allow it. And he's also searching, and you can feel the searching for like, how do we do this?
When do I get better kind of feeling?
Yeah. And it's just like, when does it stop hurting? And it might not. And that's okay. And so that for me is just like whatever's here, I'm going to allow it to be here because I know that that's how it doesn't get stuck in me. Is just like, okay, this hurts bad and I'm going to be super sad right now. And that's how it's going to keep being different. I'm going to let it be sad in this moment. And then I'm going to find my joy, like you're saying, in the next moment where I'm like, oh my God, the stars, the sky, all of it.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for listening. We look forward to hearing what your word is.
You can DM us on Instagram, or we'll probably launch a website. So be on the lookout for that. We'll tell you when that comes out with even more resources.
Awesome. Love to you. I love you, Rebecca.
Love you. Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at All the Grief Pod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.